Hey, who remembers when I did videos on games? Oh. Anyway, if I had to define my 2022, it would be me procrastinating my next One Piece video, enjoying My Hero Academia while the fanbase riots, and badgering my friends to death about my newfound love of Fire Emblem. Seriously, this franchise has squeezed itself right up next to My Hero Academia in my brain. And for good reason. It's Advance Wars meets Persona with a kick-ass soundtrack and the existential terror of losing your best friends in the horrors of warfare, which is just my cup of bloodstained tea. And thankfully I jumped on this bandwagon at the right time as there was a new game on the horizon. Fire Emblem Engage. So now I can join all you lovely people as we treat every fault in this game as a sign of the apocalypse. But I found Fire Emblem an interesting franchise to think about. Not only due to it being somehow tied with Nintendo, but since Zelda has gone open world, it's one of its few long-running franchises where its plot is at the forefront. It's something you can't remove from Fire Emblem because of how integral it is to its structure, especially considering those plots can get kinda bloody and even go to some straight-up dark places. It feels rather odd that it shares a billing with Kirby. Well, I can only speak for modern Fire Emblem. I'm not familiar with the early series. So no, I have not played Genealogy of the Holy War or Path of Radiance. Don't get me wrong, I'd like to, but playing Path of Radiance contradicts my love of having money. No, I am, as many of you will likely grown, a modern Fire Emblem fan, and I believe it's fair to state that outright. I've played Awakening, a game so bad at being a swan song that it revived the franchise, Fates, aka buy 3 games for the writing quality of barely 1, Echoes, which honors a time when characters were literal palette swaps, and 3 Houses, which I can credit for turning me bisexual. So at least I can say I have a decent frame of reference, meaning I can go to Engage as an established fan, to stand alongside the rest of you who have played Thracia 776. Please be nice. So let's fire up our emblems and dive into the latest installment of Fantasy Waifu Chess. Welcome to Curmudgeon Media, I'm Ed, and today I'm diving into Fire Emblem Engage. You are in the mythical land of Elios, surrounded by 4 kingdoms with different aesthetics. Once upon a time, war was waged against the Fell Dragon, and they were slain by summoning 12 legendary warriors from other worlds to fight by your side. The main gimmick being each of these warriors is a hero or a key character from a previous Fire Emblem game. Among them are some of the most renowned and beloved characters in the entire franchise, and also Corrin. You are Aaliyah, the Divine Dragon, who wakes up after a 1,000-year slumber with amnesia. Oh, sorry, wrong game. You are Aaliyah, the Divine Dragon, who wakes up after a 1,000-year slumber with amnesia while looking like an e-boy Todoroki.
They're the same picture.
And now the Fell Dragon is on the brink of reawakening. So now you travel the land gathering a J-pop band of allies, as well as each of the 12 emblem rings that hold the spirits of the legendary heroes. Now the main thing to point out with the narrative is that unlike a few previous entries in the franchise, Engage is a linear story with only one path, which may seem like a step down, but honestly, I can understand why. After Fate split itself into 2 games, a need was created for escalation. So 3 Houses naturally had you choose between 3 different routes. And while 3 Houses was great, its flaws are evident based on it being so much bigger in scale. And I don't think Fire Emblem could, or should, go bigger. I mean, where do you go after 3 Houses? Fire Emblem 4 Swords? Fire Emblem 5 Gum? No, that would just result in an even bigger game that would likely crumble into a convoluted mess. So Engage seems like a sensible move, like a reset. Let's just tell one story, sand off any edges, no overreaching, and throw in some nostalgia for good measure. Now Engage has already been criticized for that trimming down, as well as the quality of the story in general, to which I've heard the notion that Fire Emblem games have always had bad or mediocre stories, whereas the good ones, like Path of Radiance or the Blue Lines route in 3 Houses, are the exception rather than the rule. And I would disagree. What Fire Emblem tells are simple stories, and while they've certainly fluctuated in quality, I am strongly against the idea that simple equals bad. A story is more than its plot, and complexity doesn't always make it better. A straightforward story may not be the most exciting from the macro, but it's the micro, the little touches, that make all the difference. Awakening had a pretty straightforward story, but it more than made up for it with a fantastic cast and well-written interactions. Even 3 Houses was really just 3 linear stories with a clear structure. The only thing that changed was your perspective and your understanding of the greater whole. So a simple story can definitely work in a way that makes its simplicity worthwhile. So does Engage do that? No. But also, yeah? But not really? Maybe a bit? Yeah, the plot does tread similar ground to other Fire Emblem games. But for me, I don't mind repeating story beats if they're done well, or better. Though an immediate warning sign shot up straight away when the game opened with a flash forward that didn't end with you killing somebody. In fact, this flash forward never actually gets reincorporated into the plot. You never see this cutscene or this situation again. So good start. And with repeating plot elements from other games, it seems the most repetition has come from Fates, which, to clarify for non-Fire Emblem fans, is kinda like cheating on an exam by copying the guy drawing tits on the test. And its first major point of comparison is one of the repeating factors across the whole franchise. It's basically a meme at this point that in Fire Emblem, the only thing with a higher mortality rate than the soldiers are the parents. As soon as you awaken, you meet Lumera, the current divine dragon who claims to be your mother. And even if you hadn't seen the trailers, your instant thought would be, oh, you seem nice. I bet your funeral's gonna be lovely. It definitely doesn't help that she even looks like Queen Makoto from Fates.
They're the same picture.
But I'm happy to say that, to my surprise, Fire Emblem Engage does not kill the parent. It kills 3. Lumera is the first parent to croak after the castle is attacked and the emblem rings are stolen. And they try so hard to make us care. For a 6.5-minute cutscene, they try. But despite that, it still suffers from the Corrin issue, where they treat the death of this character who they've known for a day as the saddest thing to ever happen. And it instantly creates a rift between the player and the protagonist. Which brings us to Aaliyah. Before I get into it, I do want to give a shout out to Brandon McInnes. He's a really good voice actor and I'm a fan of his work. And he definitely brings it with the emotional scenes, even in the 6-minute mother death. And the fact that he has emotion at all is a step up given his immediate predecessor was Byleth from Three Houses, who was quite literally a blank slate.
I've never been happier.
Personality-wise, Aaliyah is fine. They seem nice, they're pretty humble, and will occasionally drop a fun line every now and then. I don't have any ill will towards Aaliyah, but I can't say I love them either, which isn't really due to them, but more how others perceive them. Since in this world Aaliyah is a literal deity, it causes everyone around them to put them on a pedestal. It also doesn't help that the initial cast are basically the stewards who have dedicated their entire lives to caring for it. And Aaliyah waking up is quite literally the highlight of their entire lives. To really highlight the problem, I'd like to do a quick comparison to the initial group of Fire Emblem Awakening. In Awakening, you get awakened by 3 characters. There's Chrom, the casual charming leader, Lissa, the playful juvenile little sister, and Frederick, the stoic tank who's just incredibly done with everyone's shit. The avatar Robin was just someone they happened to find in a field, and when they begin traveling with them, they feel like just another member of the group. Yeah, Robin gets more significant later, but that's not how they start. You're not held to a higher standard than anyone else. No one knows who you actually are, not even you, so it puts you on more of an even keel. Plus the cast themselves are a bit more diverse, and it feels like they actually had a life before you came along, which makes their interactions feel like an actual dynamic. Whereas in Engage, you have Vanda, a stoic knight who loves the Divine Dragon, Fram, a peppy girl who loves the Divine Dragon, and Clan, who is also there and loves the Divine Dragon. It doesn't help that their support trees are exclusively about their service to you. You don't pull pranks on them or teach them how to eat bear. Aaliyah is much more central to the lives of the cast, which makes it honestly feel less like an ensemble. And this was achieved in Awakening simply because Robin, technically, is not the protagonist. There is a character in Awakening who covers all the JRPG hero tropes. Handsome prince, adored by all, believes in the power of friendship with the mark of destiny and the legendary blade of cool people, but that character is not you. It's Chrom. So if anything, he's the one put on a pedestal by everyone around him, including you. And it works incredibly well. Chrom would be more boring if he was the avatar, because then we'd have to imprint ourselves onto him, which just turns into a slightly wanky power fantasy. But by not being the avatar, it lets Chrom breathe as a character, and become more of an aspirational older brother figure. And personally, I think Fire Emblem works best when the avatar is not the hero or the focus of the story. It basically takes the responsibility off the avatar, and therefore requires there to be another well-developed and likable character to bear it. This was even true for Three Houses. Yeah, Byleth is definitely one of the game's weaker elements, but I didn't mind so much because many of the game's roots aren't really about them. They're a mentor figure to the actual hero, who is, let's face it, the more interesting character. You're alongside Edelgard as she fulfills her ambitions. You're learning about the world with Claude. You're there with Dimitri as he, remains perfectly mentally sane. Engage also does something that has become a bit of a warning sign for me in Fire Emblem games, which is how it introduces new characters. Engage follows Fates in what I like to call the retainer problem is when one of the main characters joins the party and is accompanied by their 2 retainers, essentially giving you 3 characters for the time and energy of 1. And the first issue is now you have 3 people you need to characterize and get invested in, despite barely knowing most of their personalities or struggles. This was done to a hilarious degree in Fates Revelations, where you recruit 4 main characters over 2 levels, meaning by the end, you had 12 new units. In Three Houses, this wasn't an issue, because you got your main cast when you start that changed depending on which route you chose, and recruiting other characters took time and effort. And because your initial class already had dynamics with one another, the game did a fantastic job at creating an ensemble. Whereas again, in Awakening, you get your initial party when you join the Shepherds, but new characters appeared a bit more gradually. And unlike retainers, they were less likely to be linked to nobility, which allowed them to be a bit more out there. Rather than getting 3 people from the same background, they just randomly gave you Henry the Crow Guy. And we loved Henry the Crow Guy because he was weird and morbid, and he was the goddamn Crow Guy!
I'm gonna kill you!
The retainer problem dilutes the value of characters is my point, and it ends up feeling a bit formulaic in how you get them. Regardless of which of the 4 countries you go to, there will always be a main character, their sibling, and their 4 retainers. And while that is annoying, ultimately how big of an issue that is comes down to the quality of the characters themselves, which I'm happy to say Engage delivers on. While the initial cast are lackluster, it does definitely improve once you get more of a roster from the different regions. And while all of them still look up to Aaliyah as a deity, it lets the group feel much livelier and more colourful, especially as they interact with each other. The 4 Kingdom setting actually works quite well here, as despite many of them being royalty or retainers, they still feel different enough to have chemistry and fun odd couple banter, which certainly makes them all feel at the very least likeable and entertaining, with a fair few that have a bit more to them. I want to give a shout out to Yunaka, the peppy shonen girl who definitely has a body count in the triple digits.
Yeah, I have a killer's eyes.
And like with all Fire Emblem supports, it depends on who they interact with that reveals the real meat of the character. Find the right conversations and you'll get someone who evolves from a one-note unit into a pleasant surprise. For me, that surprise was Alfred. Alfred is the Prince of Firene, and the first noble you recruit outside of your initial party. His thing, if you will, is that he really likes working out. Always talking about how he wants to build up muscle, and many of his interactions are about him just being peppy and forcing everyone to go jogging with him. So far, he's likable enough in that anime sort of way. But you learn from interactions with his sister that, as a child, Alfred was severely ill and was repeatedly on the verge of death. It's never stated exactly what it was, but it's implied to be a cardiovascular problem. His final support with his sister shows Alfred on his own exercising, only to succumb to some form of attack, showing his illness is still affecting him. But despite this, Alfred begs her not to tell anyone, in order to not be seen as a liability.
I can't let them see this. A weak prince unfit to fight who could collapse any day?
None of them would see you that way. They're far too gracious for that.
But I would still know. And besides, I don't want them to worry about me. As far as they're concerned, I want to be the spirited prince who loves working out.
Not only is it just a very sad thing to see, but it recontextualizes his obsession with exercise. To him, it's about maintaining his health, and proving to himself and others that he's still reliable. And because of this, his peppiness becomes so much more endearing. Also, while we're on the subject of characters I like, Louis. I f***ing love Louis. Moving on. As you can imagine, Clam, Fram, and Vando were quickly benched, and not just because they weren't really that good. As soon as I got Ivy, the sexy, interesting wyvern rider who can use magic and healing, you can bet Fram was yeeted onto the backbench. And she was even overshadowed on the goddamn backbench. The units that I never used had the best feeling in a Fire Emblem game, which was, I wish you fitted on my roster. They were backbenched out of necessity rather than lack of interest, but it would have been good to use them. It's quite fun watching their supports on YouTube to know what they're actually like the stoic knight who writes comedy novels, the Tim Burton lolly, and whatever the hell Zelkov is.
The fate of my sauce is at stake.
Then there are the emblems themselves. And herein lies a challenge. As I said, these are some of the franchise's top characters. Many people are familiar with them either through their own games, Smash Brothers, or other means, so you'd have to do them justice and not just have them be a reference. These are characters after all. But at the same time, you can't have them be too prominent, because then they'd overshadow the new roster. I mean, they'd have to compete with Lucina, for Christ's sake. I have people in my real life who can't compete with Lucina, so what Engage presents is a compromise. The emblems can interact with every unit, but they're very brief. They're not so much conversations as they are 2, maybe 3 lines of reaffirmation, which does feel a bit disappointing, but I can understand why. There are 36 playable units and 12 emblems, so that's a total of 432 support dialogues, not even counting DLC, so perhaps it's sensible to not have them be too extensive. Wouldn't want to make every writer at Intelligent Systems simultaneously commit seppuku. And in fairness, those dialogues can still be fun. They're filled with little references that may tickle some nostalgia for some fans, or highlight one of their character quirks that have been subdued a bit in this game.
Would you believe me if I told you its name actually used to be Pointy Demon Spanker?
I love you.
Though there is one missed opportunity I can't help feel let down by. Given this is basically Fire Emblem's Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's the best chance all these characters would have to share a world. So why can't they interact with each other? That would have been fun. Yeah, I know Fire Emblem Warriors already did that, but it would have been cool to have it be a bit more official. It would allow them to actually show their characters a bit more, and maybe be a little meta. Have Lucina fangirl over Marth. Have Roy get pissed at Ike for stealing his spot in Smash Brothers. Have Corrin get called a moron by, well, everybody. Maybe that's just me though. That's the first thing that popped into my head when I learned these characters would be returning, though it does make me wonder how that would function in gameplay. Maybe you'd have to use them in conjunction with one another, or they could do some form of link attacks that... What? Why are you looking at me like that? Oh yeah, gameplay. So alongside a story and waifu hunting, Fire Emblem Engage is also a game. I should probably start with this next time. So for those of you who are watching this video and have never played Fire Emblem, firstly, you live a very dangerous life, and it scares me. Secondly, Fire Emblem is a tactical RPG that's basically like chess but with actual people, and when you lose a piece, they actually die for real. And of course, every installment adds in new things to spice up the gameplay, and Engage has added some seriously sweet spices with the new Engage mechanic. The 12 legendary warriors are spirits that dwell within rings. Each unit can hold onto one ring and get a set of buffs and abilities. You can also Engage, where your unit fuses with the emblem for a limited time, in order to get even more powers. Let me say up front that this mechanic is really cool, and one of the best things about the whole game. A lot of effort clearly went into it, even just from an aesthetic standpoint. Each unit has 12 Engage appearances, where their clothes and color schemes change depending on who they've engaged with. Now, I'm not really a design or aesthetic person, but I don't know, I just thought that was neat. But from a base gameplay standpoint, the emblems become another layer of tactics unto themselves. You have to decide not only who to equip, but who is the best unit to equip them to. As I said, each emblem brings their own powers to the table based on who they were in their own game. Celica from Shadows of Valentia was a mage, so her buffs are around magic, and her ultimate move lets you warp to another place on the map to deliver a devastating blow. Ike from Path of Radiance was a hench mercenary with a goddamn greatsword, so anyone equipped with him becomes a damage sponge that can, to put it bluntly, nuke enemies. There's honestly a lot of fun to be had in mix matching your units with powers that can either make them better at what they already do, or make them more versatile. My personal favourite was Sigurd, the guy from Genealogy of the Holy War. He was a cavalry unit in his own game, so his buffs are based around mobility, and your first instinct might be to give him to one of your cavaliers, making an already mobile unit even more so. And you can do that, or you can do what I did, which is to give him to Louis, my heavy armored knight. Armored knights get a massive buff in this game. Even without an emblem ring, they can reliably take and deal a shed load of damage. So I thought let's give him the one thing that will instantly transform him into a speedy tank. Louis then proceeded to fireman carry me throughout the whole game. I swear to God, there's one level where you're sailing towards enemy territory, and you get intercepted by 2 enemy boats on either side. The main challenge is splitting your team up to fend off both sides of the attack. For the right, I got a majority of my units gradually pushing forwards, planning a strategy and putting a lot of consideration into my every move. For the left, I just sent Louis and Sigurd, who took one step onto the boat, politely said hello, and all the enemies then ran for their lives.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
You can also inherit skills from emblems. That means that if you want a unit to retain a specific skill from one emblem, but you want to put them with another one, you can spend points to gain that skill in isolation. I basically gave everyone Corrin's ability to restore HP to adjacent allies. Thanks for being useful, Corrin. Now get back in the trash. If you're someone who likes finding exploits in games, then Engage is your cup of tea. And you'll need as many exploits as you can get, because the game is very aware that any one of your units can become a one-man army. So by design, it has to provide enough of a challenge to take on an army of one-man armies, which is my way of saying that this game is hard. I am a dedicated hard classic player. I've beaten every Fire Emblem game I've played so far on hard. And I even beat 3 houses on maddening. And even I was going, Jesus Christ, this is hard. But what I found befuddling is that it wasn't the story levels that were the hardest. It was the skirmishes. The random enemy encounters meant as a free opportunity to get some experience, to take on the story missions. But in all honesty, it felt like the story missions existed to help me take on the skirmishes. I'm pretty sure at least a third of the footage I captured was spending ages on a skirmish before soft resetting. Yes, I do that, and so do you. Also, if I may digress for a second, that village level can go in the full of fire, right in the face. Anyway, as well as general difficulty, each level definitely felt longer than it did in other games, with it being commonplace to spend over an hour on one level. But I also believe there's another reason for that. In Fire Emblem, you have the bird's eye view of the whole map, and when you fight an enemy, it zooms in to show a little 1v1 fight, which is cool, it gives it a nice little cinematic quality. But of course, after a while, you find it's best to just turn those off for time's sake. So now, instead of lengthy battles, it's just your sprites bumping into each other. And since the return to 3D with 3 houses, you now actually see animations of them hitting enemies, even without showing the full 1v1 fight. In Engage, these animations have more detail put on them. Units winding up attacks, archers pulling back their bows, etc. And I think it's this, as well as the slower cursor movement, that the fights feel longer. Since there's more attention and detail put into the game's graphics and animations, the individual actions of a move take longer to do, making the fight feel slower. Both this and the difficulty actually resulted in the final fight of the game taking me 3 hours and 12 minutes to complete. I am not joking. I had everyone huddled together, moving slowly across the map, like narcoleptic gazelles. Engage also brought something back that Three Houses got rid of, the weapon wheel, which has been an integral mechanic in Fire Emblem, where axes, swords, and lances essentially have type advantages against one another, kind of like fire, water, and grass in Pokemon, letting you deal a bit more damage and take less from specific units. And to be honest, it's a bit crap. The damage difference is negligible, and after a while, you learn that spamming projectiles from a distance works better than any type matchup. I actually think Three Houses had the right idea in getting rid of it, and using that flexibility to just add more classes, like the Brawler. But Engage somehow actually improved the weapon wheel. Using the right weapon against an enemy will break them, basically stunning them and stopping them from counterattacking the next hit. So you can soften an enemy up with a type advantage. Then you can comfortably get any unit, like a damage dealer or a glass cannon, to just rock up and finish them off, without any worry of taking damage. It's neat. They even worked brawling into it, which has now become a martial arts class that doesn't really do a lot of damage, but it can break mages, archers, and assassin units. And that's really handy, I presume. I wouldn't know because martial artists do bugger all damage, so it was mainly easier to just snipe them from a distance. But I do appreciate the thought behind it, though it does make me miss the days when brawlers were absolute beasts. Gone are the days of sending in Raphael to beat a demon to death with literally his bare hands. Another thing about modern Fire Emblem is you now have the ability to rewind turns if you make a mistake, meaning you don't have to soft reset every time your unit dies. And I appreciate that in Engage, the means of doing this isn't really focused on in the plot. In Three Houses, Byleth had the power to reverse time, and clearly did it a few times within the story. But even though this was a great gameplay mechanic, you've still opened up a can of worms by loudly announcing that your hero can time travel. And the plot then has to make some excuses as to why your time travel powers couldn't have impacted this integral story beat. Whereas in Engage, you just pick up a crystal that you're told can rewind time, and your response is, huh, neat. Anyway, which is how it should be, to be honest. It is pretty generous with how many times you can rewind turns, but like I said, given the length some of these levels go to, you're gonna need them. Overall, this is some of the best gameplay Fire Emblem's had. It's challenging and allows a lot of customization, while adding features that actually build on the existing formula. If you enjoy the feeling of playing Fire Emblem, then you'll have a blast with Engage, regardless of its story. Oh yeah, we should probably address that. I'll be entirely honest with you, dear viewer. I've been pretty brief when describing the story so far, for two reasons. Firstly, I'm terrible at structuring videos. It's a miracle I can spell. Secondly, I've honestly found the plot difficult to talk about. Throughout the game, I have bullet points of things where I can make apt comparisons to other games or how it could have been done better, and yet I just can't muster the energy to write it all down. And the thought of editing all those points just fills me with apathy. But why is that? Surely getting to break something down that's terrible is cathartic and fun to watch? Well, that's the thing. For me at least, the plot wasn't terrible. It was just meh. It did very little to make me stand up and cheer, but it also didn't do much to aggravate me either, which is more than I could say with Fates, with its we need to fight the true villain but we can't tell anyone who they are because then the plot wouldn't happen thing. And whether a meh plot is worse than a terrible plot is subjective, but it definitely makes it less fun to dissect. The most interesting points to talk about are when the story has a direct impact on gameplay, and there is one moment that actually does this really well. At Chapter 10. At this point, the game has laid out its structure. You go to one of the 4 kingdoms, recruit one of the nobles and their 2 retainers, fight villains, get new emblem rings, recruit the other noble and their 2 retainers, more villains, go to next kingdom, repeat until you have all emblem rings, final boss. And despite the 4 kingdoms having vastly different environments and cultures, this formula remains the same, which after a while made it feel somewhat like a Mario game. And while I was still having fun with the gameplay and characters, I felt sure it wouldn't really do anything to divert from that formula. Then Chapter 10 happened. By this point, you've got about 6 of the 12 emblem rings. You and your ragtag posse of friends and emblems travel to Elucia to stop them from resurrecting the Fell Dragon. But by the end of that level, all of your emblems have been taken from you, including Marth, the one you've had since the very beginning. Not only that, but they get turned and used against you. And the next level starts with your party running for their lives from enemies that have the emblem rings you lost. And you really feel that sense of loss that the characters feel, as a layer of gameplay you got accustomed to gets stripped away from you. You also lose the time crystal, so you're running for dear life from your former OP weapons while you can't reverse a turn. That was scary. I mean, 3 turns later someone defects and gives you back the crystal and 2 new emblem rings. But I didn't mind it, because in that scenario, I felt as the characters did. Scared for my life, and Louie's life, my friends' lives. And when I eventually did get some new rings, I felt genuine relief and happiness, since one of those rings was Lucina. Yes, I know I have a problem, and I choose not to solve it. From there, you escape and have to build yourself up again with new emblem rings that have yet to be claimed. And honestly, it was pretty good storytelling through gameplay. It is, however, the highlight of the story, and the repetition begins to set back in, to even the point it repeats the parts of it that were good. Remember when I said the game kills 3 parents for the price of 1? Those parents are Lumera, the mother of the main character, King Morion, the father of one of the other main characters, and King Hyacinth, the father of another of the main characters. And to be honest, these don't even need to be in the spoiler section, because Hyacinth is a henchman to the Fell Dragon, so naturally after they're revived, he gets eaten for a laugh, because it turns out pimping yourself out to Satan is not the smartest career move. And Morion has so many death flags around him, it's actually hilarious. I mean, he even looks like if Mufasa was an anime dad.
They're the same.
But there was something about Morion's death that did strike a little chord. See, Morion, isn't killed nobly on the battlefield. He's wounded and then abducted to be a sacrifice for the Fell Dragon, in which Chapter 10 is the rescue mission. But once you get there, the ritual has already been completed, but Morion isn't dead. Morion was corrupted, becoming a zombified version of his former self, and you, along with his 2 sons, have to kill him. And if either of his sons face him in battle, they both have a little unique dialogue with him, thanking Morion for being a loving father.
Was I a good son? I should have asked you that sooner. You instilled in me pride and strength. And most importantly, you gave me your love. I should have told you what that meant.
And it was legitimately quite sad. Not exactly groundbreaking, but it at least gave it more of an emotional impact. So I don't have an issue with that. I do have an issue with the game doing that for the other dead parents. Hyacinth comes back, where you have a similar interaction with his 2 daughters. And take a wild guess who the penultimate boss fight is. Yup, it's Lumera. Dead parents coming back to life only to be enemies. Where have I seen this before? No, Corin, put the gun down! Neither of these have the gut punch, well, gut poke, of Morion. Because again, one was a henchman, and the other is someone who the game is trying to convince us is important, but has done little to actually prove so. As I said before, this franchise kills parents to a memeable degree. But the issue here is that it struggles to characterize them outside of their role in the story. Or worse, they retroactively characterize them. Which, unless you're Alan Moore, don't do that. Lumera could have been a bigger part of the story if she wasn't insta-killed in the inciting incident, and what's sad is that she could have been interesting, but as it stands, it makes the dynamic with Aaliyah feel a bit wanting. This could have been like losing the emblems, if perhaps there was some sort of gameplay mechanic she offered that was lost upon her death. Maybe a playable unit, or even something like Futaba in Persona 5, where she occasionally offers a buff or healing. But no, it's just another MILF for the chopping block. And you'd think a franchise that kills so many parents would get better at characterizing them. And overall, it struggles to muster up enough to really hit that emotional point again, and that includes its twist. While everyone hails you as the Divine Dragon, you have nightmares about a version of yourself with pure red hair causing destruction. And after fighting one of the main villains, it gets confirmed that you are, in fact, the child of the Fell Dragon. Again, not exactly groundbreaking for Fire Emblem, but this is a massive revelation that would shake the foundation of Aaliyah, as well as his followers, all of whom have been praising them non-stop throughout the game. I was honestly expecting an identity crisis on a Cloud Strife level, but then after a quick pep talk, everyone just kinda moves on. Not just that, but as your memories return, you see that you were never actually evil. You defected to Lumera, and actually killed the Fell Dragon before, so it's not even Aaliyah dealing with their dark past. Which begs the question, what was the point of Aaliyah having amnesia? If they were redeemed prior to them going to sleep, why hide the fact they were the Fell Dragon's child? There's a character in Engage who is another child of the Fell Dragon, who basically has 2 split personalities, one nice and friendly, the other evil and murderous. I kind of expected a similar thing with Aaliyah, where they had to come to terms with their evil side, but it's an evil side that wasn't really evil, which is a shame. That duality could have helped Aaliyah stand out more as more of a personal adversity to overcome, but it's perhaps not the most productive use of time to think of what could have been done. So sadly, the story does not live up to expectations, especially considering it follows a story with as much lore and intrigue as 3 Houses. But as I said, there's fun to be had in the characters, and the nostalgia. I will even say that the closing moments were quite bittersweet. After you defeat the Fell Dragon, the emblems leave your world forever, and having them each say farewell one at a time was nice. I've only played 4 of these games, and even I got a little bit of the feels, so I can only imagine what it would be like if I played all of them. And despite the flaws, I watched the credits and epilogue with a sense of satisfaction. Though one thing I will admit upsetted me, probably more than it should have, no romance. In the DS games, there were S-rank supports, which was basically romance and marriage, whereas it was taken out for Three Houses, and instead the endings were organic, based on who spent the most time together. But Engage doesn't have it at all, save for someone you can romance with Aaliyah by giving them a ring. And in its defense, you can give it to anybody, regardless of gender, which is a nice step forward if nothing else. Take a wild guess who I gave it to. Though I will admit he was not my first choice. Take it.
Listen.
Take it!
See.
Fucking take it! Screw Robin, this is real! But in the epilogues, it's just each individual character rather than pairs, which is a bit sad. And I get this might just be me, since I am a fan of a good romance, but there's an additional downside of this, which makes it feel less like a unique playthrough. Romances felt like an additional detail, based on your playthrough and tactics. It was like, not only did you get to see everyone's happy ending, but you got that little extra personalized touch, where it turns out that Ignatz and Marianne got together, holy fuck, they did it! I'm so proud of them! They deserve all the happiness! Again, that might just be me. Whereas in Engage, without that, it's just, hey, this character lived, which, to be entirely honest, gives me less incentive to replay the game, because I know now that I'll get no different variations. It would only mean anything if I didn't get a character, or if someone died. And as we've established, I'm a dedicated soft resetter, so we'll be having none of that permadeath here. And replayability is the key word here. With the singular story that leaves a lot to be desired, as well as no variations on the ending or epilogue, I don't have much reason to play the whole game again. I might occasionally play a skirmish just for a laugh, and I know there are those challenges, but I don't feel inclined to start completely fresh. When it comes to character interactions, I could just watch those on YouTube. And have. Ultimately, I feel as if I've gotten everything I needed out of one playthrough, and that's not really the feeling I wanted. When I finished Three Houses, I instantly started a new game to play a different route. When I finished Awakening, I started a new game because I loved the company of the characters. When I finished Engage, I re-downloaded Three Houses. Again, this is not due to Engage having a singular story, but more a singular story that doesn't delve as much into the little things that it needs to truly work. I said earlier that a simple story can be saved by the micro elements, and while Engage does have those, I'm sorry to say that it just simply isn't enough. Fire Emblem remains one of the most flawed franchises I have ever loved. And I say that because, despite my limited experience, they always feel like they're on the cusp of perfection, but with something easily identifiable holding them back. I genuinely believe that if you combined the gameplay of Engage, the characters of Awakening, and the storytelling of the Blue Lines route from Three Houses, you wouldn't just have the ideal Fire Emblem game. You would have Game of the Year material. The faults in the later games, especially Fates and Three Houses, are evident, but they were faults due to overambition. You can tell they wanted to do something big and grand, but couldn't deliver on all of it. And don't get me wrong, a flaw's a flaw, but there's at least something kinda nice about seeing a vision that someone clearly had, even if it didn't reach those heights. But Engage's goal seems to be not to overreach itself, but to keep itself concise and polished, which means its issues aren't due to overambition. They're just issues. Also, with Fates and Three Houses, you can tell the nugget of their conception was their world and premise, and everything else was built around that, whereas Engage is built around a gameplay mechanic, making the story and world feel almost secondary. And given what I said about Fire Emblem being one of the few plot-driven franchises associated with Nintendo, it feels more damning that the story was the drawback. There is also the concern that since the game is delving into nostalgia, as well as even more anime-isms, that may be signs of worry for where Fire Emblem will go. So taking all of that into account, how does Fire Emblem Engage make me feel about the future of the franchise? Honestly, very excited. And here's why. Firstly, as I said, Engage being a single story means that the expectation has basically been reset. It's not bound to mimic or one-up previous entries as it once was, which means it could feasibly try a story on the same scale of Fates again, and do it better. Or they just stick with one story and improve on it, or even do something entirely new. Secondly, the references and nostalgia could actually work to the franchise's benefit, because while a Japanese audience is aware of all these characters and their games, a Western audience won't be. The first experience the West had with Fire Emblem was through Smash Bros. Melee, which garnered enough interest for a worldwide release of Fire Emblem 7. But now everyone has become familiar and potentially intrigued by even more characters from the early stages of the franchise. Engage could basically be what Smash Bros. Once was, an introduction to characters nobody knew of. And that could be a window into interesting opportunities. They've already remade some of the first Fire Emblem games, but with Engage, they have more of a foot in the door with fans. They can very easily go, hey, remember Sigurd? That guy who absolutely wrecked shop with Louis? Do you want to know what his deal is? Boom, genealogy remake. You'd have an audience already familiar with the character and provide them with a gateway to learn more. Not only would it be a fun way for established fans to get some nostalgia through remakes, but keep in mind, many of Fire Emblem's earlier games never officially released in the West. Sigurd may be a throwback character for Japan, but for the West, he's entirely new. You've opened a window to simultaneously cater to nostalgia and introduce new stories to a new audience. So from my perspective, this could be an amazing opportunity for the next game to be anything. Now that can obviously go the other way too, which is a bit scary to think about, but that's the point. Anything can happen now. Criticism of Engage's story is certainly everywhere, but we know that intelligent systems have at least addressed feedback in the past. People complained that Awakening had too simple of a story, so they tried to amend that with Fates. And when people complained about Fates, they made Three Houses, which was basically that but focused into a single game. I like to think the feedback they're getting for Engage won't go unnoticed. Look, I realize it's not exactly a compliment to say, I hope you do better next time, and perhaps I am being naively optimistic. I don't think people will look back on Engage with as much love as Awakening or Three Houses, but perhaps the breathing room it gave the franchise could be enough to make something truly special. And if that day comes, we may view Engage as we do Fates, with annoyance, but also gratitude for what it led to.
Listen. Listen. Music. Listen. Music. Listen.
What the hell is my life?
Listen.